Thank you very, very much. It's wonderful to be here today. You'll probably be able to hear from my voice that I spent some of my childhood growing up in South Africa. And one of the things which I love about Africa, actually one of the many things which I love about Africa, is that Africans, they love to tell stories. And if you think about it, that's the way we have communicated since the beginning of time, is by telling stories. That's also how we have connected. And so what I want to do today is I want to tell you 3 stories. These are 3 stories about swimming, and swimming in some of the most challenging environments on this earth. And I hope that it gives you some food for thought as we end off this fantastic conference. So let me start with the first story. This is a photograph of the North Pole. So this is a photograph which we took in 2007 when we arrived at the North Pole. I was there to attempt the first ever swim across the North Pole. I remember standing there, I remember looking out over this icy terrain and thinking to myself, this is going to be a really cold swim. Let me just put this water temperature into perspective for you. A normal indoor swimming pool is about 27 degrees centigrade. 18 is a temperature of the water in the English Channel in summer. Now drop all the way down to just 5. That's the temperature of the water in which the passengers of the Titanic died. Fresh water obviously freezes at 0 degrees centigrade. This water is even colder. It's salt water. It was minus 1.7 degrees centigrade. Minus 1.7 degrees centigrade. And nobody had ever done a swim in anywhere close to this water temperature before. And I remember waking up on the morning of the swim and opening the curtains on the ship and looking out over this icy terrain. And there was so much ice and the sky was gray. And thinking to myself, with these conditions, this swim is impossible. Anyway, I get a knock on the cabin door and it's my coach. He walks in, he said, Lewis, he said, how do you feel this morning? I said, David, I think in these conditions, this swim is impossible. And he looked at me and he said, no, Lewis. All of us, we all believe that you can do this swim. I said to him, David, with all due respect, there's only one of us getting in the water today, and that's me. I said, I really do think that this swim is impossible. He said to me, no, Lewis, you have trained so hard for this swim. You've done swims in the Arctic. You've done training down in Antarctica. Yes, these conditions look tougher and the water is slightly colder, but I believe that you can do this swim. And he said to me, I'm going to give you 2 anchors, and I need you to hold on to these 2 anchors between now and when we do the swim later this evening. And whenever you doubt yourself, whenever you think that this swim is impossible, please just hold on to these 2 anchors. So he said, the first thing I want you to do is, I want you to go all the way back to the beginning of your life. I want you to turn around, and I need you to get perspective. So I want you to tell me all those moments in your life which have molded you into the person which you are. So start from the beginning. Well, I said to him, probably the first most important moment in my life, I grew up here in England. When I was 10, we moved out to South Africa, and we lived very, very close to a big elephant national park. And during the holidays, I was very, very lucky. My parents would take me to this national park, and that's where my love for nature began. David said, great. What's the next big moment in your life? I said, when I was 21, I swam across the English Channel, and I thought that it would take me around about 10 hours to get to France. And in 9.5 hours, I'm putting my head up and I'm saying, are we nearly there? What about now? Are we nearly there? And my coach is saying to me, Lewis, you better swim because you're in a current. Anyway, I swam as hard as I could, and that current just picked me up. I was in the right place at the wrong time, and that current just picked me up and just dragged me all the way along the French coast, and eventually, after nearly 15 hours, I finally put my feet on French sand. He said, good. What's the next big moment in your life? Well, I said I studied law in South Africa at the University of Cape Town in the final days of apartheid. And one of my lecturers was arrested and put into solitary confinement, simply fighting for justice and fighting for equality as a young law student that left a very, very big mark on all of us in the class. And the next big moment, well, I then returned back to Britain. I became a maritime lawyer, and I was involved in a very, very big oil pollution case. There was a ship which was sailing off Alaska, and it ran aground. And that ship spilled 250,000 barrels of oil in one of the most sensitive areas of Alaska called Prince William Sound. That ship was called the Exxon Valdez. Anyway, it completely destroyed the environment and the economy in the region. And so from that moment on, I decided to try and do swims in the most fragile parts of the world and to get them protected. David said, great. He said, now what I want to do is I want to give you the second anchor. I need you to walk all the way to the end of your life and turn around and ask yourself, why are you here today and what is your message? What is your message? And I said, it's very, very simple, David. I said, for the last 7 summers, I have visited the Arctic, and every single summer, I have seen that ice getting thinner and thinner and less. And I want to do a simple, symbolic swim here, across the North Pole, across a place which has been frozen over for thousands and thousands of years. You shouldn't be able to do a swim here. And I hope that it shakes world leaders, many of whom were denying what was happening at the time. So David said to me, great. So Lewis, when you doubt yourself, hold on to these anchors. And then he said to me, I'm now going to leave you, and I'm going to come and collect you this evening and take you to do this swim. And so he left the cabin, he closed the door, and there were many times during that day when these negative thoughts came into my mind, I can't do this, and so I would just go back to the beginning of my life and say to myself, Lewis, you're meant to be here today. Early in the evening, he calls me, and we then go onto the upper deck of the ship, and we look out over this icy terrain. And now, in the late afternoon, everywhere we could see these huge open patches of sea. This was the first time in human history that the North Pole had unfrozen. And I realized that what I was witnessing will eventually impact every single person on this planet and every single future generation, and obviously the whole of the animal kingdom. The doctor is standing next to me. He's going to supervise the swim. He says, Lewis, can you come down to my cabin now? I need to put a chest monitor around your chest. There's going to be an antenna on your back that goes through to a computer, and so I can see what is happening deep down inside you. So we both go down to his cabin. He puts his chest monitor on my chest. As he's putting it on, his hands start to shake. Now, you know, when one of the world's top expedition doctors' hands start to shake, you think to yourself, Lewis, are you really sure that you want to do this swim? And actually, it was only at that moment that I began to realize what everybody else in the team was also going through. And I looked to him and I said, Tim, I'm so grateful to you, because there are not many people who'd be prepared to come all the way here to the North Pole and supervise a swim like this. And always a gentleman, he said, Lewis, it's a privilege to be here today, but let's just get this damn swim over and done with. And so we walk off the ship, we walk down onto the ice, and I made the most stupid mistake. I walked right up to the edge and I looked in at the water, and the water was completely black. I've never ever in my life seen completely black water before. The Russians, they call the Arctic Ocean the Black Ocean. It was so frightening, I actually had to take a step back. Over there is David, my coach. He comes running up to me. Underneath his arms, he's got 10 long flagpoles with national flags on it. He said to me, have you looked into the water? I said, yes. He says, I've got an idea, just hear me out. Now, I'm not the type of person that trains literally for 5 years for a swim, and then we're going to change everything a few minutes before we're going to get in. But he was very, very persuasive. He said to me, Lewis, you want to swim across the North Pole. You want to do a 1 kilometer swim, which you think will take you round about 20 minutes. Now, our whole team consists of 29 people, and we come from 10 nations. So I bought and not all of us could go there to the North Pole. It's extremely expensive to get to the North Pole, to hitch a ride on a Russian ship, which goes to the North Pole once a year. So he said, so what I've done is I bought all 10 national flags of the 29 people, and I wanted to put them over there at the North Pole. I wanted you to dive in here, swim along the edge of the ice until you get to those flags. They will get you to the North Pole. He said, but I just had an idea. He said, why don't we put one of these flags at every 100-meter mark? And all I want you to do is I'm going to tap you on the shoulder. I want you to dive in. And I just want you to swim 100 meters. Until you get to that first flag, I then need you to slow down. I need you to look at that flag and think about all the men and all the women from that nation who've inspired you so much and helped you so much to be here today. And when you've done that, put your head down, swim another 100 meters, do the same thing, and so on and so forth until you get to the end. He said to me, it's crushingly obvious. The idea of swimming a kilometer in this dark, black, icy cold water, it looks impossible. But I know that you can swim 100 meters. Well, I just thought this was a fantastic idea. It was very, very inclusive, and it broke this swim down into small, manageable chunks. What I hadn't anticipated, though, was what was going to happen next. Suddenly, we have this serious argument in our team. Which flag is going to go first? Which flag will be in the middle? And which flag will be over here at the North Pole? And as everybody is arguing this out, I thought to myself, actually, which is the most important flag? And then for me, I realized which one it should be. You know, the first flag is very, very important because when you start something in life, that's an important moment. Or the halfway mark, which is reassuring. Or the final flag, which is so wonderful. But for me, the most important flag would be this flag over here, the flag at the 900-meter mark. And I say this, and I'm as guilty as anybody else, but sometimes in life, things get so tough, they get so hard, they get so challenging that we give up at the 900-meter mark. And when we do that, a number of consequences flow as a result of this decision, which actually have long-lasting consequences. The first is that after the swim, you just want to kick yourself because you were so close to achieving your dream and you gave up. But the other consequence is that quitting or not finishing a job properly can quite easily become a habit in the team. And so I looked amongst all these flags. I thought to myself, which one is going to go at the 900-meter mark? Well, we were really, really lucky. We had an Australian in the team. His name was Jason Roberts. He was a cameraman on the expedition. Now, I'm half British and I'm half South African. And obviously, there is a strong rivalry between Britain and Australia. There's an even stronger rivalry between South Africa and Australia. In fact, there's a fierce rivalry between almost every country and Australia. So I leant down, I picked up the Australian flag, I walked past Jason, the Australian, and I handed the flag to David and I said, you put the Australian flag at the 900-meter mark because there is no ways on this earth I will ever, ever give up in front of an Australian flag. Once that was sorted out, then David said to me, he said, Lewis, I want you to come here and I need you to do a quick brain flush. Now, a brain flush is get all the thoughts out of your mind and think about just one thing, and that's executing this swim perfectly. And so he said, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this. And so we go from 5 minutes to 4 to 3 to 2. And at 2, I can feel this raw fear inside my stomach. Okay, the world is divided. It's divided between pioneers and followers. you are either a pioneer or you're a follower. You can't be both. And if you're a pioneer, you don't know what's going to happen until you dive into the water, because nobody has ever been in there before. And so all the risk, all the worry is on you. Anyway, I just tried to get these thoughts out of my mind. Then David said to me, "Okay, Lewis, are you ready?" I said, "I'm ready." He goes, "Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. And as he said 1, this thought came into my mind, and it just stopped me right there. And the thought was, if things go horribly wrong now, how long will it take for my frozen body to sink the 4.5 kilometers to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean?" Which is kind of the worst possible thought that you can have. But quite by coincidence, we had arrived at the North Pole at 11 p.m. on the 15th of July, which was the exact same time, the exact same day that my father had died a few years previously. And I'm thinking about my mother in Cape Town, and I'm thinking, if I die in the next few minutes trying to prove this point to world leaders and trying to get them to take meaningful action to protect our climate, I leave my mother without her husband and her son. I turned to David and I said, "David, if things go horribly wrong, please don't let me do the full kilometer. Pull me out after 500 meters." He grabs me, he pulls me away from the edge of the ice, and he says, "Lewis, what are you doing? What are you doing?" He said, "If you dive into this water, preparing to swim a kilometer, but also thinking about getting out halfway, you're going to be confusing the most important part of you, your subconscious, because you're preparing now for victory and defeat in your mind at the same time." He said to me, "Lewis, now's the time to believe in yourself, to believe in us as his team, and to carry your message." He ended off by saying, "Lewis, there is nothing more powerful than a made-up mind." He said, "I need you to come back to the edge of the ice. I'm going to give you another countdown, and then I want you to dive in and swim straight to the North Pole, and we will be with you every single stroke of this swim." So I walked back up to the edge of the ice. He went 3, 2, and as he said 2, I just dove straight into the Arctic Ocean. I'm now going to show you a short film which is going to take you to the North Pole and show you what happened. So here we go.
We're just sailing out of harbour now, and it's at this stage when one can have a bit of a wobble mentally. Everything just looks so grey around here and looks so cold. Just seen our first polar bear. It was absolutely magical. A mother and a cub. Such a beautiful sight. And to think that in 30, 40 years they could become extinct. It's a very frightening, very, very frightening thought. We're finally at the North Pole. This is months and months and months of dreaming to get here. Years of training and planning and preparation, and in a couple of hours' time I'm going to get in here and do my swim. It's all a little bit frightening, but and emotional. Amundsen, you ready?
Ready.
Ten seconds to swim. 10 seconds to swim. Go for it. Get on. Go, 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 go.
Take the goggles off.
Take the goggles off.
Yes, slowly, slowly. Lewis, wait.
We right here for you, Lewis. We got a towel.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
These are pluckies. Let him just go. Let him just go.
Come, then. Come.
Okay, take the shoes. Quickly, take the shoes.
Well done, Lewis. You did it. You did it, Lewis. You did it. You did it, man. Well done, Lewis. You did it. You done it.
How on earth did you do that?
Against the current, Donna. You did it against the current.
Thank you so much. Which brings me now to the second story. I love this photograph. This is a photograph which was taken by a photographer called Kelvin Troutman from South Africa. And this photograph is taken at a place called Land's End. For those of you who are perhaps not from Britain, Land's End is at the beginning of the English Channel. So it's the most southwest point here in England. And just to give you some background, about 2,000 people have swum across the English Channel. So from Dover to Calais, about 2,000 people. But nobody, and it's 33 kilometers, but nobody had ever swum the length of the English Channel, which isn't 33 kilometers, but it's 528 kilometers. And it starts in Land's End and it ends in Dover. And so a few years ago, I decided, okay, I want to try and become the first person to swim the length of the English Channel. So I went down to the start of the English Channel at Land's End, and there I made 3 promises to my team there on the beach. The first promise I made them, I said to them, it's obvious that if you're going to try and swim for 528 kilometers, you're going to have doubt. So I said to them, the first promise I'm going to make you is that I'm going to try and leave all my doubt here on the beach at the beginning. I said, the second promise I'm going to make you is that every single day I'm going to swim 10 kilometers. We then mark the position, we sail to shore, we sleep, we then go straight back to that same position the next day. I said, the third promise I make you is that if we can't even go out on a specific day because there's a big storm out at sea, I said, the following day, I'll do a double session. I'll swim 20 kilometers. I then shook their hands and then I ran into the sea, and that's the picture which Kelvin grabbed as I started this enormous 528 kilometer swim. Well, the first week was absolutely wonderful. I was swimming along the Cornish coastline. The beaches there are beautiful, golden beaches. The sun was beautiful. My back was nice and warm. I then get to the second week, and I arrive in Plymouth, where I grew up as a young boy. It was a homecoming. It was fantastic. I then had to swim across a very, very big bay called Lime Bay. And because of the way the wind had been blowing, the bay was completely full with jellyfish. Now, jellyfish are the most unforgiving of animals because they always get you in specific places. Let me just tell you where they always get you. First of all, if you're a swimmer, it's straight in the face. It's always such a shock. Even if you know there are jellyfish in the water, when you get a jellyfish straight in the face, it's such a big shock. The second place they get you as a swimmer is you take a stroke and then you sometimes get their tentacles wrapped around your arm. And if you're very, very lucky, you can get the tentacles into your armpit. And so every single stroke which you take, you're rubbing that poison deeper and deeper into you. And if you're especially lucky, as you take a stroke, you accidentally scoop them between your legs, which is obviously a high consequence environment. However, eventually we get to the city of Portsmouth, which was a halfway point, and then everything changed. It was storm after storm after storm coming up the English Channel. There were some days where I couldn't swim, so the following day it was a double session, 20 kilometers. Eventually, after 49 days of swimming, I finally arrived in Dover. There I am, putting my hand against the harbor wall. I had completed this swim. I actually don't think that I could have swum another kilometer. I was so physically and mentally exhausted, but I'd made it. Anyway, the reason why I was doing this swim was because I was trying to get the British government to properly protect the waters around the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom is actually quite a big island. The waters around the UK are 720,000 square kilometers, of which, at the time, only 7 square kilometers, hear this, 7 square kilometers were fully protected. In the rest, you can drill for oil, you can drill for gas, big fishing fleets can come along and take all the fish, the Navy can come along and do gunnery exercises, and water companies can pour raw sewage into the sea. In just 7 square kilometers, some of the beautiful wildlife which we have around the United Kingdom, puffins and dolphins and whales, they are able to live in peace. Anyway, I felt so strongly about this that every single day I was on television urging the British government to sort this out. I get to the end, and there to meet me was a man called Michael Gove. Now, Michael Gove used to be the environment minister. He walked down the beach. He said, "Congratulations, Lewis." He said, "We've heard you." I said, "Michael, I wish you had heard me before I swam for 49 days. I said, the science is very, very clear now. The science is now, because of the speed at which our climate is changing, we now need to be protecting at least 30% of the world's oceans now by 2030 for them to stand any chance of recovery. He said, I'm going to take your message to the Prime Minister. A month later, the United Kingdom stood up in the General Assembly in New York at the United Nations and committed. They were the first big nation to commit to protecting 30 by 30, as we called it. And they urged other nations to join them in this endeavor. And since then, 130 nations have agreed to this standard and are now protecting the waters around the world. It's amazing. Thank you. I never had any idea that when I started out on this simple swim that we could have had such a result. But the reason why I'm telling you this story is that I don't believe that I'd have been able to dive in, swim for 528 kilometers, through the storms and through the jellyfish, get to the end, deliver the message, and then keep pushing the other nations of the world to also agree to this standard. I don't believe I'd have been able to do that had I not made those 3 promises at the beginning, and most importantly, my team kept me to those 3 promises each and every day. Which brings me now to the final story. This is a lake high up in the Himalayas. This lake didn't exist 30 years ago. This lake is called Lake Imja. It's in Nepal. And what is happening now in the Himalayas is that the glaciers are now beginning to melt away because of the climate. And as a result of that, the constant water supply to some of the most populated countries in the world, India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that constant water supply is at risk. And this is not just water for drinking, this is water for agriculture, it's water for industry, it's water for energy production. Water is essential for life on Earth. And so I decided to go up onto Mount Everest, so onto the highest mountain on this earth, and do a swim in a lake which has just appeared in a glacier on Mount Everest. So I put a team together. We went to Kathmandu. From Kathmandu, we went to a little village called Lukla, and then we start the hike up onto Mount Everest. And shortly before we got to Everest, we came to this lake, and so the leader of the expedition, who used to be a general in the British Army, he said to me, he said, Lewis, I need you to swim across this lake so that I am confident that you can swim at this altitude. And so I dived in, I swam across the lake, no problems at all. I got out and he said, come on, Lewis, let's go up onto Everest and let's do this big swim. And so we climbed up another 300 meters. It took us 3 days. Okay, we climbed up another 300 meters until in front of us was this lake on the Khumbu Glacier on Mount Everest. I got the same team next to me. David said to me, are you ready? I said, I'm ready. He goes, 3, 2, 1. And I dive into this lake and I start swimming across this lake. In less than 30 seconds, I realized I was in deep, deep trouble. I just couldn't breathe. We're 5.5 kilometers above sea level. There's so little oxygen there. And then everything unraveled really, really quickly. I just had no strength to turn my arms. My arms start slapping the water. My legs, I can't hold them up. They start dragging in the water. I start choking. And from the corner of my goggles, I can see the British general screaming to me to get out the water. I swim towards him. He runs into the lake. He grabs me. He lifts my head out the water. And he says, Lewis, I'm so sorry, it's all over. He said, I'm so sorry, Lewis, but if I allow you to carry on with this swim, you'll just be another person that dies on this mountain. He said, I'm going to take you off this mountain as quickly as possible. And so he quickly dressed me, and he walked me all the way down this pathway to the little village called Gorakshep. And there we put up our tents, and there we just rested, and I got more oxygen into my bodies. At the end of the second day, he walked up to me and he said, would you like to have another go at this swim? And I said, yes. He looked at me and he said, I knew you were going to say that. He said, if you want to have another go at this swim, you need to take a radical tactical shift. I said, what? He said, a radical tactical shift. He said, why are you swimming so quickly? And I held up my hands and I said, after that North Pole swim, I could barely feel this hand for 3 months afterwards. I said to him, I always swim fast, aggressive, crawl. That's the only way I can swim in cold water. Well, he looked at me with this real frustration, and he said to me, Lewis, this water's warm. I said to him, what do you mean? It was 2 degrees. I said, what do you mean it's 2 degrees? He said, Lewis, stop being fussy. The issue here is not the cold, Lewis. You swim in colder water. The issue here is lack of oxygen. He said, so what I suggest you do is the following. Instead of swimming as quickly as possible, I need you to swim as slowly as possible and preserve your oxygen. He said to me, instead of swimming crawl, I want you to start swimming breaststroke now. And then you can breathe whenever you need to. And lastly, he said to me, instead of swimming with all this aggression, which may work when you swim off Cape Town or swim at the North Pole, he said, I recommend you start swimming with real humility. And he pointed up to Mount Everest and he said to me, you cannot bully Mount Everest. You change, Lewis, or you will drown. And you know, when somebody frames something like that, you really do listen. So the following morning, we started going back up that mountain. Now, in the meantime, we'd been able to get a small inflatable boat up from Lukla. Anyway, the boat arrived, and now we've got to carry this boat up to the lake. It would be fair to assume that we were the first people ever to try and take a boat up Mount Everest. Eventually, though, we get back to that lake. This is a photograph which was taken by a man called Michael Walker, who was photographing for Reuters. And in the front of the picture, you'll see these bubbles. This is a photograph which he took during that disastrous first swim. I'm trying to get to the edge of the lake. The lake is very, very shallow. I'm trying to get there. That's causing the bubbles. The general is just about to run in and grab me. I'm back there 3 days later, and I think to myself, Lewis, if you swim too quickly, you can drown. If you go too slowly, though, you could very easily become hypothermic, and that also has very, very serious consequences. So I've got to get the timing of this perfect. There's a young Nepalese climber called Sanjeev. He can see I'm frightened. He says, come over here, Lewis. There's a big rock here. He said, the two of us are just going to sit here together. And he put up these beautiful little Nepalese prayer flags, and we sat down. And he says, Lewis, we're not going to start this swim until everybody is calm and relaxed in this team. And we're sitting there, and I'm just watching these climbers leave base camp and now start walking their way through the Khumbu ice field, through the clouds, onto the highest point on this earth. And it was so peaceful. And eventually I feel ready. And I stand up, and I shake his hand, and I said to him, thank you so much, Sanjeev. And then I slowly get into the water. Well, the first 250 meters, there's no problem at all. I then do the next 250 meters, there's also no problem at all. I then get to the 600-meter mark, and suddenly I'm feeling really cold. I get to the 700-meter mark, I'm even colder than I was at the North Pole. I get to the 750-meter mark, I think to myself, Lewis, unless you switch into crawl now and sprint the last 250 meters, you're going to die in this lake. I'm just about to go into crawl, and from the edge of the lake, I can see Sanjeev standing on a rock, screaming at me. I pull my head out the water to hear what he's saying, and all he's saying is, slower, Lewis, slower. And luckily, I listened to him, and I swam the last agonizing 250 meters until I got to the end. He grabbed me. He gave me a huge hug and an enormous kiss. The British general came up to me, and he didn't give me a hug, and he didn't give me a kiss. I do love this photograph because there's the general, General Tim Toyn Sewell there in red, and there's Sanjeev down there in orange. And I know what Tim is thinking. He's thinking, thank God he finally listened to me. But we learned two really important lessons there on Mount Everest. The first one is obvious, and that is just because something has worked in the past, and so swimming fast, aggressive crawl is the way I had swum for 20 years. Just because something has worked in the past doesn't necessarily mean it'll work today, and certainly doesn't mean it'll work tomorrow. But the other lesson is also about change, and that is you can change your stroke, you can change your speed, but for real, for effective change to take place, one has to be prepared to completely change one's mindset. What I want to do now is I want to bring these three stories back here to this room. What are these three stories about? Well, the first story, what was that about? Well, that was about undertaking a swim across the North Pole in unimaginably cold conditions. But underlying it was a story about diving in and committing 100%. It was a story about commitment. The second story, what was that about? Well, that was about undertaking a swim along the length of the English Channel, but underlying it was a story about building good habits and taking action every single day. Good habits get us through the storms of life because they make us more resilient. It was a story about how to build resilience in our teams. And then the final story, what was that about? Well, yes, that was about doing a swim on one of the most incredible mountains on this earth, but underlying it was a story about change. Sometimes we need to have the courage to break old habits just to get the job done. We need to learn how to become adaptable. And bringing these three stories back here to this room, what is my message? Well, we are now living in a very VUCA world. I don't know if you've heard of that acronym before, but they use that in the military context. We're living in a world which is volatile. We're living in a world which is uncertain. We're living in a world which is complex and very ambiguous. And we're certainly living in a world which is very, very polarized. And nobody knows what further storms there may be on the horizon. But what I do know is as follows. If we are committed, if we're resilient, and if we're adaptable, we're able to achieve things which afterwards people say, wow, I really didn't think that was possible. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very, very much.